In the pre-dawn darkness of June 4th, 1942, the vast Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly under a blanket of stars. Beneath the surface of those seemingly peaceful waters, two mighty fleets moved toward each other like ancient titans preparing for battle. What was about to unfold would be decided not in hours, but in mere minutes. 5 minutes to be exact. 5 minutes that would shatter the dreams of an empire, sink 4 aircraft carriers, and change the course of World War II forever. This is the story of Midway, where American dive bombers achieved what many military historians call impossible. In less time than it takes to make a cup of coffee, they would deliver such devastating blows to the Imperial Japanese Navy that the rising sun would never again dominate the Pacific. But to understand how this miracle of timing and courage came to pass, we must first journey back to those fateful months when Japan seemed unstoppable and America teetered on the edge of defeat. 6 months earlier, the world had watched in shock as Japanese bombers turned Pearl Harbor into a graveyard of twisted steel and burning oil. The attack was a masterpiece of military planning, catching the American Pacific Fleet completely off guard. Battleships capsized, destroyers exploded, and nearly 2,400 Americans died in what President Roosevelt called a date that would live in infamy. But Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, knew that his victory was incomplete. The American aircraft carriers, the most valuable prizes in the Pacific, had escaped his trap. As 1942 dawned, the Japanese war machine rolled forward with terrifying momentum. Hong Kong fell. Singapore surrendered. The Dutch East Indies collapsed. American and Filipino forces on Bataan and Corregidor fought desperately before succumbing to overwhelming odds. Across the Pacific, from Wake Island to the Solomon Islands, the rising sun flag flew triumphant. The Japanese Empire had expanded to cover an area larger than any military conquest in human history. Yet Yamamoto understood what many of his colleagues did not. Time was not on Japan's side. America's industrial might, once fully awakened, would eventually overwhelm even the most disciplined and fanatical Japanese forces. The window of opportunity was closing rapidly. Japan needed one more decisive victory, one final crushing blow that would force America to negotiate peace and accept Japanese dominance in the Pacific. The target Yamamoto chose was a tiny atoll in the middle of nowhere called Midway. 2 small islands surrounded by coral reefs, home to a few thousand American servicemen and countless seabirds. On the surface, Midway seemed insignificant, but Yamamoto saw its true value. Capture Midway, and Japanese bombers would threaten Hawaii itself. More importantly, the Americans would have to fight to defend it, and when they came, Yamamoto would be waiting with the most powerful naval force ever assembled. The combined fleet that sorted from Japanese waters in late May 1942 was a sight to behold. At its heart sailed the Kido Butai, the mobile striking force that had devastated Pearl Harbor. 4 massive aircraft carriers led the formation. Akagi, Yamamoto's former flagship, her flight deck scarred from countless battles. Kaga, a veteran of the war in China, her hangars packed with experienced pilots. Soryu and Hiryu, sister ships built for speed and striking power. Together, these 4 carriers could launch nearly 250 aircraft, more than most entire air forces. Surrounding the carriers was a constellation of warships that represented the cream of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Battleships with guns that could hurl shells over 20 miles, cruisers bristling with anti-aircraft weapons, destroyers racing through the swells like hunting wolves. In total, more than 160 Japanese warships spread across thousands of miles of ocean, all converging on one tiny speck of coral and sand. But unknown to the Japanese, their most carefully guarded secret was already compromised. Deep beneath Pearl Harbor, in a basement room filled with the clatter of typewriters and the hum of radio equipment, a small team of American codebreakers worked around the clock. Station Hypo, as it was known, had been chipping away at Japanese naval codes for months. By spring 1942, they could read roughly 40% of all enemy communications. Commander Joseph Rochefort led this band of linguistic warriors, brilliant, eccentric, and utterly devoted to his work. Rochefort had recognized patterns in the intercepted Japanese messages, references to something called Operation MI, preparations for a major offensive, and most intriguingly, repeated mentions of a target codenamed AF. The breakthrough came through clever deception. Rochefort suspected AF was Midway, but he needed proof. Working with Midway's commanders, he arranged for the island to send an uncoded message reporting problems with its water purification system. Within days, Japanese intercepts revealed that AF was short of fresh water. The trap had worked. Midway was indeed the target. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, faced, but his forces were badly outnumbered. The Americans and Hornet were already at sea. Yorktown limbed an agonizing decision. His intelligence told him where and when the Japanese would strike, had only 3 aircraft carriers available. Enterprise been to Pearl Harbor after the Battle of the Coral Sea, her flight deck torn open by Japanese bombs, her hull scarred by near misses. Navy engineers estimated it would take 3 months to repair Yorktown properly. Nimitz gave them 3 days. Working around the clock, repair crews swarmed over the wounded carrier like ants. Welders worked by searchlight. Carpenters replaced shattered deck planking. By May 30th, Yorktown was ready for sea, patches of fresh paint marking where enemy bombs had torn through her steel skin. The American plan was audacious in its simplicity. While the Japanese expected to achieve surprise, they would instead sail into an ambush. The 3 American carrier task forces would position themselves northeast of Midway, hidden beyond the horizon. When the Japanese carriers launched their attack on the island, American dive bombers and torpedo planes would strike them while their decks were crowded with refueling aircraft. It was a desperate gamble. The Americans were outnumbered in ships, planes, and experienced pilots. The Japanese had been fighting in the Pacific for 6 months, their crews battle-tested and supremely confident. American naval aviators, by contrast, had seen little combat. Many had never dropped a bomb in anger or faced enemy fighters in aerial combat. But the Americans possessed something the Japanese had lost: surprise. And on the morning of June 4th, 1942, that advantage would prove more valuable than all the experience and training in the world. As dawn broke over the Pacific, Japanese bombers rose from their carrier decks like deadly clouds of steel and aluminum. Their target lay 240 miles to the southeast, a tiny American outpost that would soon feel the fury of the rising Sunday. But while Japanese pilots flew toward Midway, American dive bombers were already climbing into the morning sky. Their bomb bay doors sealed around 1,000-pound explosives, their pilots checking their watches and calculating distances to target. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic reversals in military history. In less than 5 hours, 4 proud aircraft carriers would be burning wrecks. An empire's dreams of Pacific conquest would lie in ruins on the ocean floor, and a small group of American aviators would achieve what their enemies thought impossible, delivering victory from the jaws of certain defeat in just 5 devastating minutes that changed the world forever. The morning air was crisp and clear as the first Japanese bombers appeared over Midway Island at 6:30 a.m., their engines droning like mechanical hornets against the pale dawn sky. Anti-aircraft guns erupted in desperate response, filling the air with black puffs of smoke and deadly shrapnel. The Marines on the ground watched in grim determination as enemy bombs began falling on their runways and hangars, explosions blooming like deadly flowers across the coral landscape. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Shannon, commanding the Marine air units on Midway, had already launched everything that could fly. Ancient Brewster Buffaloes and newer Grumman Wildcats clawed for altitude, their pilots knowing they were outmatched but fighting anyway. The Japanese Zeros, sleek and deadly, tore through the American formations with practiced precision. Within minutes, most of the Marine fighters were either shot down or limping back to base, with smoking engines and shattered canopies. But while Midway burned under Japanese bombs, the real battle was unfolding far to the north, where Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo paced the bridge of his flagship Akagi. The same man who had led the carrier force in the Pearl Harbor attack now commanded the most powerful. Yet something felt different this morning. His reconnaissance planes had found nothing. No American ships, no enemy carriers lurking beyond the horizon. Nagumo faced a commander's nightmare. His first strike had attacked Midway successfully, but his pilots were reporting that a second attack would be needed to fully neutralize the American base. Meanwhile, his reserve aircraft sat on the hangar decks below, armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes for use against enemy ships that might appear. Should he launch immediately against targets he could not see, or rearm his planes for another strike against Midway? At 7:15 a.m., Nagumo made the fateful decision that would doom his fleet. He ordered his reserve aircraft, rearmed with land attack weapons. Hundreds of sailors immediately began the dangerous process of removing heavy torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, replacing them with high-explosive bombs designed to destroy buildings and runways. Aviation fuel lines snaked across the carrier decks. Ammunition carts rolled between parked aircraft. The pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy had become floating powder kegs. Then, at 7:28 a.m., everything changed. A lone Japanese scout plane, delayed by mechanical problems, finally reached its search area and spotted what every Japanese commander dreaded most: American warships steaming southwest, including what appeared to be at least one aircraft carrier. The pilot's radio crackled with excitement as he reported his discovery, but his message contained a critical flaw. He failed to specify exactly how many carriers he had found. Nagumo's face went pale as he received the report. American carriers were only 200 miles away, well within striking range. His own decks were cluttered with aircraft being rearmed for the wrong mission. His first strike was still returning from Midway, low on fuel and needing immediate recovery. The careful every passing minute in Japanese plan was unraveling with a panic. Nagumo ordered his planes rearmed again, this time back to anti-ship weapons. Sailors scrambled to reverse the process they had just begun, rolling heavy torpedoes back onto the hangar decks while removing the land attack bombs they had just installed. Fuel lines remained connected. Ammunition lay stacked in neat piles around the aircraft. The normally immaculate Japanese carriers now resembled chaotic workshops rather than precision war machines. Meanwhile, 200 miles to the northeast, American carriers were launching everything they had. From Enterprise came 33 dive bombers, 14 torpedo planes, and 10 fighters. Hornet contributed 35 dive bombers, 15 torpedo planes, and 10 fighters. The damaged Yorktown managed to launch 17 dive bombers, 12 torpedo planes, and 6 fighters. In total, 151 American aircraft rose into the morning sky, their pilots knowing they were flying toward the most dangerous target in the Pacific. But the American attack was far from coordinated. Navigation errors and communication failures scattered the strike groups across hundreds of miles of empty ocean. Hornet's dive bombers flew too far south and never found the enemy at all, eventually returning to their carrier with their bombs still attached. Enterprise's torpedo squadron became separated from its fighter escort and flew alone towards certain destruction. The first Americans to find the Japanese fleet were the torpedo bombers from Hornet, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron. Flying their obsolete TBD Devastators at wavetop level, Waldron's men approached the enemy carriers with grim determination. They knew their planes were slow, their torpedoes unreliable, and their chances of survival almost zero. At 9:20 a.m., Waldron's 15 torpedo planes began their attack runs against the Japanese carriers. 0 fighters dove on them like hawks attacking sparrows, their machine guns and cannons tearing the American aircraft apart. One by one, the Devastators tumbled into the sea, leaving oil slicks and debris floating on the swells. Within minutes, 14 of the 15 planes were destroyed. Only Ensign George Gay survived, floating in the water among the wreckage, watching in horror as his squadron mates died around him. The torpedo squadrons from Enterprise and Yorktown suffered similar fates. Flying without fighter protection, they pressed home their attacks with suicidal courage, only to be slaughtered by overwhelming Japanese defenses. By 10 a.m., 35 of the 41 American torpedo planes had been shot down. Their torpedoes either missed entirely or struck their targets without exploding. Victims of defective American technology, Japanese pilots and sailors cheered as the last American torpedo plane fell into the sea. They had destroyed nearly 3 entire squadrons without losing a single carrier. Admiral Nagumo began to relax, believing the American threat had been neutralized. His own strike was being prepared for launch, ready to deliver a crushing blow to the enemy carriers. But the sacrifice of the torpedo bombers had not been in vain. Their low-level attacks had drawn every Japanese fighter down to sea level, leaving the high-altitude approaches undefended. More importantly, the carriers had been forced to maneuver violently to avoid the torpedo attacks, disrupting their tight defensive formation and leaving them scattered across miles of ocean. High above the Japanese fleet, unseen and undetected, 2 squadrons of American dive bombers were about to arrive at precisely the right moment. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey from Enterprise had been searching for over an hour, his fuel running dangerously low, when he spotted the wake of a lone Japanese destroyer racing northward. Following that wake like a highway in the sky, McCluskey led his 33 Dauntless dive bombers toward their destiny. At exactly the same moment, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie from Yorktown approached from a different direction with 17 more dive bombers. Neither American commander knew the other was there, but fate and timing were about to deliver them simultaneously over the most valuable targets in the Pacific Ocean. It was 10:22 a.m. on June 4th, 1942. The Japanese carriers steamed in loose formation, their decks crowded with aircraft being prepared for launch. Fuel lines snaked between the planes. Bombs and torpedoes lay stacked around the hangars. The ships were floating ammunition dumps, primed for devastation. And diving toward them from 15,000 feet, unseen against the bright morning sun, came the instrument of their destruction. The moment had arrived. At 15,000 feet above the Japanese fleet, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey pushed his Dauntless into a near-vertical dive, the wind screaming past his canopy as gravity pulled him toward his target. Behind him, 32 more dive bombers followed in perfect formation, their 1,000-pound bombs locked and loaded, their pilots' hearts pounding with anticipation and terror. From his cockpit, McCluskey could see the Japanese carriers spread out below like toys on a blue carpet. Akagi steamed majestically in the center, her flight deck packed with aircraft. To her right, Kaga moved through the swells, equally vulnerable. The carriers had no idea death was plummeting toward them from the sun-bright sky above. The Douglas SBD Dauntless was not the fastest aircraft in the sky, nor the most glamorous. Navy pilots had nicknamed it slow but deadly from its initials, and the moniker fit perfectly. What the Dauntless lacked in speed, it made up for in precision and ruggedness. Its perforated dive brakes allowed pilots to maintain control during the steep, near-vertical attacks that made dive bombing so devastatingly accurate. McCluskey's altimeter unwound rapidly as he dove toward Kaga. The massive carrier grew larger in his bomb sight with each passing second, her flight deck details becoming crystal clear. He could see Japanese sailors scurrying across the deck, fuel hoses snaking between parked aircraft, ordnance stacked in neat piles around the hangars. The carrier was a floating bomb waiting for a spark. At 2,500 feet, McCluskey released his 1,000-pound bomb and pulled back hard on his stick, feeling the crushing force of gravity as his Dauntless clawed its way out of the dive. Behind him, his bomb fell true, arcing through the morning air toward the heart of the Japanese fleet. But McCluskey wasn't alone. All around him, other American dive bombers were releasing their deadly cargo in a symphony of destruction that would last exactly 5 minutes. Lieutenant Dick Best, leading his 3-plane section from Enterprise, had chosen an even more prestigious target. Akagi, the flagship of the carrier force, steamed below him like a steel island. Best's bomb bay doors yawned open as he reached release altitude, and his 1,000-pound projectile dropped away cleanly, beginning its fatal journey toward Yamamoto's former flagship. The Japanese were caught completely by surprise. Their fighter cover was still at sea level, having just finished slaughtering the American torpedo bombers. Anti-aircraft gunners swung their weapons skyward desperately, but the steep angle of the diving Dauntlesses made tracking almost impossible. The Americans were diving so fast and so vertically that Japanese gunners had mere seconds to acquire their targets before the bombers flashed past. On the bridge of Akagi, Admiral Nagumo stared upward in horror as American dive bombers materialized from the sun like avenging angels. "Dive bombers!" someone screamed, but it was already too late. The carefully laid plans of 6 months, the dreams of Pacific conquest, the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, all hung in the balance of the next few heartbeats. Lieutenant Norman Kleiss from Enterprise had selected Kaga as his target, and his bomb struck the carrier's flight deck with devastating precision. The explosion ripped through the wooden planking and into the hangar deck below, where aviation fuel and ammunition created a chain reaction of secondary blasts. Kleiss pulled his Dauntless out of its dive and kicked his rudder to look back at his handiwork, witnessing Kaga being torn apart by a series of explosions that exposed her steel skeleton like a disemboweled whale. The timing was absolutely perfect, though entirely accidental. While McCluskey's Enterprise dive bombers attacked from one direction, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's Yorktown squadron approached from another angle. Their targets the carriers Soryu and Hiryu. The Japanese found themselves under simultaneous attack from multiple directions, their defensive fire scattered and ineffective. Leslie's bombing run on Soryu was a masterpiece of precision flying. His Dauntless screamed down through a storm of anti-aircraft fire, black puffs of smoke blooming around his aircraft like deadly flowers. At exactly 2,000 feet, he released his bomb and hauled back on his controls, feeling his aircraft shudder as it pulled out of the dive. His bomb struck Soryu's flight deck near the forward elevator, punching through the steel and exploding in the hangar deck below. Within seconds, all three carriers were burning. Akagi, struck by Best's bomb near her midships elevator, erupted in a pillar of fire and smoke as aviation fuel ignited throughout her hangar spaces. The blast killed Captain Taijiro Aoki instantly and wounded Admiral Nagumo, who was thrown to the deck by the concussion. Flames raced along fuel lines and engulfed parked aircraft, turning the pride of the fleet into a floating inferno. Kaga suffered an even worse fate. Multiple bomb hits along her flight deck created a hellscape of fire and destruction that defied description. Her captain lay dead on the bridge, killed instantly when the first bomb ignited a fuel truck parked nearby. Commander Takahisa Amagai, the air officer, found himself in command of a dying ship as uncontrollable fires raged from bow to stern. The devastating accuracy of the American attack stemmed from years of training and the inherent advantages of dive bombing tactics. Unlike level bombing or torpedo attacks, dive bombing allowed pilots to release their weapons from relatively close range while approaching their targets at angles that made defensive fire nearly impossible. The steep diving angle meant that American aircraft spent minimal time exposed to anti-aircraft fire, flashing through the defensive envelope too quickly for effective tracking. But the real secret of American success lay in the split-second timing that brought multiple squadrons over the Japanese fleet simultaneously. The earlier sacrifice of the torpedo bombers had drawn Japanese fighters down to sea level and scattered the enemy formation. When the dive bombers arrived, they found the carriers in their most vulnerable condition possible, with fuel lines open, ammunition scattered across the decks, and no air cover overhead. Soryu, the third victim of this aerial apocalypse, suffered 3 direct hits that turned her into a blazing wreck within minutes. Her captain, desperately trying to save his ship, ordered the flooding of the forward magazines to prevent a catastrophic explosion. But the fires spread faster than damage control parties could contain them, and soon the entire forward section of the carrier was engulfed in flames. The Japanese sailors fought their fires with desperate courage, but they faced an impossible task. Aviation fuel burned at temperatures that could melt steel. Ammunition cooked off in continuous explosions that shook the carriers like earthquakes. Smoke poured from shattered hangars, creating pillars of black that could be seen for miles across the Pacific. Admiral Nagumo, wounded and stunned on Akagi's bridge, watched in disbelief as his magnificent fleet disintegrated around him. 3 of his 4 carriers were burning hulks, their aircraft destroyed, their crews fighting for their lives against uncontrollable fires. The carefully planned operation to capture Midway and destroy the American fleet had become a nightmare of destruction and defeat. Yet even as 3 carriers burned, the battle was not over. Hiryu, the 4th and final carrier of the Japanese striking force, had escaped the initial attack through a combination of luck and positioning. Her captain immediately began preparing a counterattack, determined to salvage something from the disaster that had befallen his fleet. The clock showed 10:27 a.m. In exactly 5 minutes, the balance of power in the Pacific had shifted completely. Three of Japan's most valuable warships were dying, taking with them hundreds of experienced pilots and thousands of skilled sailors whose loss would cripple Japanese naval aviation for the remainder of the war. But the American dive bombers were not finished. As they climbed away from their burning targets, their pilots already knew that somewhere in the smoke and chaos below, one Japanese carrier remained operational. And until that final threat was eliminated, victory at Midway would remain incomplete. The smoke rising from three burning carriers cast long shadows across the Pacific, but Captain Tomio Kaku aboard Hiryu was not ready to surrender. His carrier had escaped the devastating American attack through sheer chance, positioned several miles away from her sister ships when the dive bombers struck. Now, as the only operational Japanese carrier remaining, Hiryu represented the Empire's last hope for salvaging victory from catastrophe. Kaku wasted no time in launching a counterstrike. Within an hour of the attack on his fleet, 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters roared off Hiryu's flight deck, their pilots grimly determined to avenge their fallen comrades. Their target was the American carrier Yorktown, spotted by reconnaissance planes steaming northeast of the battle area. The Japanese pilots found their quarry at 12:10 p.m., and their attack was executed with the same precision that had made the Imperial Navy feared throughout the Pacific. Diving through fierce anti-aircraft fire, they direct hits on scored 3 Yorktown's flight deck. The explosions tore massive holes in the carrier's steel plating and started fires that sent black smoke billowing into the afternoon sky. But Yorktown refused to die easily. Her damage control teams, trained to perfection by months of war, fought the fires with desperate efficiency. Within 2 hours, they had patched the flight deck and restored power to the ship. To Japanese observers circling overhead, Yorktown appeared to be back in action, ready to continue the fight. And so, in those 5 minutes that changed history, American dive bombers had accomplished the impossible. 4 Japanese carriers lay broken and burning on the Pacific floor, taking with them the dreams of an empire and the lives of Japan's finest naval aviators. What began as Japan's most ambitious operation had become their greatest defeat. The rising sun that had blazed so brightly across the Pacific now flickered and dimmed, never again to threaten American shores. Victory at Midway proved that courage, sacrifice, and perfect timing could overcome even the mightiest foe.